Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to welcome today His Excellency Carlos Ayenbaum, the Ambassador of Latvia to Canada. Ambassador Ayenbaum is going to be talking to us today about NATO and Latvia. Mr. Ayenbaum was a lecturer in history at the University of Latvia in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and joined the Foreign Ministry in 1993. He served in a number of positions, including as the Foreign Policy Advisor to the President of Latvia in the late 90s. The Foreign Affairs Press Secretary, which is an ambassador-level appointment in the Latvian Foreign Affairs Ministry from 2013 to 2015. Mr. Ayenbaum has been an ambassador in a number of different places, including the Netherlands, in Israel, in Estonia, and most recently, from 2016 on, in Canada. We're also going to hear from our Canadian VDF, Lieutenant Colonel retired, Steve Macbeth. As many of you know, Steve started in the Canadian Armed Forces as non-commissioned officer with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. He was commissioned as in the Royal Canadian Regiment, the RCR, in 2003. He's been deployed overseas to Bosnia, to Kabul, and twice to Kandahar. And this is where these two come together. He was the commander of the NATO Enhanced Force, the the NATO Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group in Latvia. It should be also noted that Steve was awarded the Medal of Honorary Recognition by the Minister of Defense of Latvia for his work while he was there, leading the integration efforts with the Latvian Armed Forces. And so it's a great pleasure to have these two together to talk about, in the shadow of Lech Plēsis, deterrence on NATO's eastern flank, and either the ambassador or Steve is going to talk about what Lech Plēsis is actually going to be in the shadow of. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming the ambassador.
Thank you, Director Nosal, and I will leave Lech Plēsis to Steve because he spent more recent time in Latvia. He knows the latest update on Lech Plēsis. Even the guy is, there's no his picture of Lech Plēsis, but Lech Plēsis is a mythological hero from very, very long time ago. Thank you for this nice introduction. It's a pleasure to come down here from snowy Ottawa to probably it's already spring outside here in Kingston. Anyway, it's nice to be here in Old Capital, and I would like to say thank you to all who made this event happen here. I will read. English is not my first language, in order to save some time. But I am always appreciative if there are questions, and there's no questions what we cannot answer. As you know, that even the question on the small video was very nicely answered just 10 minutes ago by your Prime Minister. And you see, everything is explainable in our days. I will speak about the security and defense, and why NATO troops are deploying to Latvia with Canada at their core, and why is it is necessary to increase deterrence and resilience. So, first of all, let's talk about security, looking especially at Latvia and the Baltic Sea area. We are happy that one of Canada's footprints in the global landscape is on the sandy beaches of Latvia. Canadian troops are forming the hardcore of the battle group in Latvia, one of the 4 battle groups stationed in the eastern part of Alliance. The others are in Estonia to the north, and Lithuania and Poland to the south. It was good luck that brought Canada to lead this battle group as framework nation. We also have soldiers from other 9 nations: Albania, Czechia, Italy, Montenegro, Poland, Slovenia, Slovakia, and Spain. Altogether, 1,500. And this multinational character of the battle group itself, with a blend of countries from the north and south of Europe, is a clear message of determination and resolve. Clearly, communicating that one is ready to protect one's own prosperity sounds like a good thing. But nonetheless, one hears the argument that Russia will only become more nervous and irritated with the enhancement of the NATO presence, and Latvians and Poles would be much safer if no one comes to help. I would argue that showing hesitance and standing back in itself could be provocative, if such a posture left doubts about NATO's resolve to defend its territory. You remember, only short 5 years ago, that Russia was taking Crimea by direct military force, through proxies, and with the threat of additional military force ready to roll in. Moscow Donbas operation is ongoing, and in 2008, Russia went into South Ossetia, in the southern territory of Georgia, and made it theirs. The Kremlin saw the opportunity, and it took them. Mr. Putin believed he could get away with taking Crimea. He has been right for the time being. Even if and when Crimea is returned, real damage was done. The Baltic states had to wait 50 years for a return of their freedom. It was a long wait. Lessons learned from Russia's adventures at redrawing the map are that you do not want people in the Kremlin imagining a benefit in snatching things that do not belong to them. So, when heads of state and government got together in Warsaw in summer 2016, they were able to arrive at a shared view that the wisest way to deter Russia's current tendencies toward aggression was by placing NATO multinational forces in 4 key countries: Poland and the 3 Baltic states. Canada and the other small NATO forces in the eastern part of Europe by themselves alone would probably not resist a large-scale military attack by the Russian Federation for long. But this is not the point. The purpose of NATO enhanced forward presence is to rule out casual contemplation of an attack. While NATO is adopting measures to reinforce and protect its territory, Latvia is also taking steps on its own to ramp up security. With security, we have not only been a recipient, but also a provider. Per capita, going by size of our population, Latvia has been amongst the top contributors to international peacekeeping missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we have also contributed to the missions in the Mediterranean, in Mali, and off the coast of Somalia. We are also members of the coalition to combat ISIS. Latvia also reaches 2% of GDP for defense. Very topical question. It is based on a very obvious need. Russia's military activities close to NATO borders are a concern that can keep us up at night. It keeps up the people in Sweden at night as well. Otherwise, they would not have opted for conscription in 2017. Russia does very little to allay concerns. In fact, they knowingly feed and stoke the concerns. Russia's military buildup has been steady and systematic. They conduct snap exercises without advance warning, and these exercises are offensive. This has been happening for years, and NATO has done its best to ignore it for years. And what a snap exercise transforms into a real exercise. And a couple aggressive military exercises and maneuvers, including single military planes flying with transponders turned off, with what is being done in cyberspace, and we understand that we are witnessing a Russia which is purposefully creating conditions which are conducive to unintended incidents, accidents, and escalations, not only in our region, but in the Pacific and in Mediterranean. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers took part in the Zapad 2017, West 2017 military exercise. NATO has been relatively meek. The organization has acted in a manner that minimizes the chances of Russia seeing its actions as a threat. This meekness was not meant to be perceived as a weakness, but rather as an encouragement to cooperate. Russia used this to its advantage. Over the past decade, Russia has been building an overwhelming military presence nearby to the Baltic Sea. Ironic, since the Baltic Sea is virtually synonymous with a sense of peacefulness and even pacifism. When you think of the Nordic or Baltic countries, you think of people working hard and minding their own business. You think of cooperative countries. We would all like to be friends with friendly Russia, but even those that hope and strive for the better times, and that includes virtually all of the countries that border Russia, it is generally understood that there should be no return to business as usual until the day when Russia returns to a policy of obeying of the international law. And this is why, in the exception of that bright day, Latvia and Canada will be maintaining a two-track approach in dealing with Russia. One track is to generate a meaningful military deterrence, and another track is having a dialogue. Look at this from the Russian perspective. No country respects spinelessness. With some backbone comes some respect. So, respect can actually breed dialogue. Latvia and Canada are both open to that dialogue. And it should be equally clear that the results of dialogue that we seek are at the very least greater predictability and mutual transparency. Nothing, however, in those results of dialogue should be things that erode our security and hurt our genius interests and the values that are fundamental to our identity. We must be very sure that we know our interests. Dialogue must contribute to our national security and to NATO's security. It is imperative that we not accept Russian actions in violation of the law as some kind of a new normal. Russia's disregard for the existing international law is bad, not just in the region. To have a country willing to bend and break the rules-based order and to seem to profit from such behavior can tempt others to behave in a similar manner. We should not be smiling about Russia's weak economy either. A weak economy does not mean that Russia will be more accommodating, more open, or more cooperative. On the contrary, military activities that project strengths may be regarded as a welcome distraction from the weak economic performance. The attitudes were not made up overnight or over a long weekend. Russia has long regarded the states along its border as falling within its special privileged sphere of interest. and it has set in place policies which reinforce this perception. You can see these policies reflected in the military doctrine. We should therefore expect political and military leaders in Russia to do things which create challenges for peace and security so long as these policies are in effect. We can hope for breakthroughs, we can hope for implementation of the Minsk agreements, we can hope for Russia that play ball and is with us at least on matters of common interest, but our hope should be tempered by a knowledge of the existing constellation of forces, actions perpetrated over time, and Russia's readiness to probe, to provoke, and to exploit a lack of readiness and any lack of ambition in protecting and defending. The NATO deployment decision on the 4 battle groups came after, not before, Russia's decision to place 3 new divisions near NATO's eastern flank. This sequence of events does not stop Russia from proclaiming time and again that NATO is pursuing a confrontational policy and that Russia is defending against NATO moves. As 21st century people, you almost all are adept at operating in the digital world, and this is an area of confrontation quite appropriate, especially when it comes to analyzing the fight for hearts and minds. That is part of the formula for taking physical things by force, resources, land or property. We face a combination of older games and the newer games in the information space where Russia's state-controlled media are impacting how people understand the news, sowing doubts and muddling the truth so much that even well-educated people became disoriented. And this half-truth is even more dangerous than a simple lie. A lie you can detect at some stage, but half a truth is sure to mislead for the long term. The facts will win the day, the truth will always matter. In the dimension of the internet and cyberspace, the European Union has a role, and Latvia is a keen believer that the European Union's efforts must join together with the NATO is doing and be mutually reinforcing. EU-NATO cooperation today is not an option. It is the best way to deal with hybrid threats and develop resilience. We cannot afford to come up short when it comes to civil-military coordination. Latvia is home to the NATO Center of Excellence for Strategic Communication, something that Latvia itself first proposed and built up. For situational awareness, we need the support of all like-minded partners. The changed security environment has also provided a strong impetus for even closer cooperation with Finland and Sweden, non-NATO countries. It goes without saying that Finnish and Swedish voices are integral to the future of the Baltic Sea area, and we value their views and situational awareness, which help us clarify and better understand the security environment. Our NATO battle group does not have a giant footprint. It is pretty small, but it is backed by NATO, which has a pretty darn big footprint, and this is what needs to be made quite visible. Potential adversaries need to know that NATO's Article 5 is not some old phrase in some agreement on parchment paper that might or might not apply in a current time of need. With its footprint in Latvia, Canada is highlighting to all to see that Article 5 means all for one and one for all in today's circumstances. Challenges to alliance are increasing, and I should not leave you with the twisted notion that Russia is the only challenge. Canada, as its other footprints around the world show, is quite conscious of threats, and it has a foreign policy that advocates sensitivity for regular people who can get caught up in a crisis. This is what could be called a moral side of foreign policy, and Canada's leadership in this regard is crucial not just for Latvia, but for countries that are whose compasses are oriented towards sustainable international development and doing good out on other edges of our interdependent world. Good that will have a resonance at home in Canada. It's good for the country's image. It increases Canada's visibility and recognition, especially in Europe, and it reinforces and strengthens the transatlantic link, a link which is also the cornerstone of Europe's defense. Canada's contribution in Latvia strengthens the link and anchors the cornerstone. At this pivotal moment, Latvia welcomes the support of Canada's men and women in uniform. It should be recognized that not just any ally was suited to lead the multinational battle group in Latvia. It makes sense that a country like Canada, which sees diversity as a strength, is chosen to lead the most diverse of all battle groups. And it helps to choose a country that Latvians like. Latvians simply like Canada. Many do not even know why. But I'll tell you why. Latvians in Latvia see themselves as connected with Canada and drawn to it, as a land of promise and a land of refuge for relatives who fled World War II, and because it's friendly, clean, and sometimes tough. In connection with this troop deployment, people in Latvia were asked about their associations with Canada. Hockey was the answer given by most. 1/3 of respondents thought of hockey when they were thinking of Canada. Yes, there is an unmistakable and unmissable hockey connection. Latvia has made that connection stronger by investing in a secret weapon. And you know about that, right? We are importing coaches from Canada. Our World Championship team is coached by a Canadian, Bob Hartley, from Hawkesbury, Ontario, not far from here. Before Hartley, we had Indigenous. We had the Chief Ted Nolan. We have seen that Canadian coaches give us an edge, and in 2014, Latvia came awfully close to beating Canada in the Olympics. Didn't happen this time. Around a tenth of Latvians polled said that they saw in their mind's eye wealth and prosperity in Canada. They saw Canada's maple leaf logo and maple syrup, and lots of trees besides maple trees. Also plants, shrubbery, forests, rivers, mountains, birds of prey, and polar bears. Life up north in all its natural beauty. But most Latvians did not think of beavers when they thought of Canada. We have plenty of beavers in Latvia and will be ready to export them if you run short. Dear friends, the military art is geared towards avoiding wars and preserving peace. But at the same time, military history proves that we must be ready to protect ourselves. Together we are united in our resolve to protect alliance territories and prevent conflict. We welcome Canada's contribution to Euro-Atlantic defense and feel good that Latvia is a host country for the Canadian-led NATO battle group. Together we stand for our universal Western values. From Latvia's perspective, the transatlantic bond is essential to European defense. There is no substitute for this bond, and Canada's presence in Latvia is strengthening that bond and strengthening the peace in our peace-loving Baltic Sea region. The Baltic states may have the geopolitical disadvantage of living on a security fault line, but they have acquired experience and skills that are invaluable to their friends and allies around the world. And large places will show it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Today, what I'd like to do is take from the great strategic frame that the ambassador provided us from Latvia's vision of why EFP is required, and then walk it down to the kind of tactical realities on the ground. As I kind of look out of the crowd, I see kind of a cross-section of people, and it's kind of a theme as we go through the tactical realities. So we have the students of Queen's that are in the kind of initial steps of understanding policy, international relations. The fellas and group in the back corner that's going to be leading the mission in this summer. Military professionals and military educators that are here to also learn how have Canada's missions evolved. And then of course our contract friends that are here to understand how to train the force and go from there. But actually this cross-section of diversity is something that's quite relevant as we look at the mission inside Latvia. And if you just look at the title slide, it's kind of put up there on purpose, and across the top with the Latvian flag in the background are the 9 NATO nations that support it. And each nation, if you look, is a different uniform, they have a different posture, they have a different understanding, they have a different culture, they have different weapon systems. And you have to somehow fuse those ideas together to bring them to bear in the defense of Latvia under this Article 5 construct. And so how did we do that? How do we get to understand our Latvian partner as we first showed up? And it was interesting for me as a quick side note. 2 things came to me. First, my brigade commander, my Latvian brigade commander, when I showed up, he met me and then I recognized him. And the reason I recognized him is that we'd already shared a battlefield. When I went on my 3rd tour to Afghanistan, I had to do some training in Germany as we were being the operational mentoring liaison team. He was across the hall from me and was doing an omelette in northern Afghanistan. And in fact, we had an operation in Helmand where the Latvians were moved down south. And so we had actually shared operational space. And so the commonality of the NATO missions, and so when you hear some of the strategic discussion of can it work or will it work, what's interesting is the commonality across those nations and the commonality in there. The Slovenian members that we had, we'd also served with in Afghanistan. And so those connections of professional soldiers run deep. 2, he told me that, oh, don't worry, Steve, we know your national anthem. We call it the hockey song, because every time we play you, we hear it at the end. So Lech Plessis, the bear slayer. And I mean, it's pretty interesting to immediately kind of look at this image by the great poet Andrei Pumpurs in 1918 as Latvia first came to independence during that time. And it's a story, and a simple story and poem of a young man in a village who's threatened by a bear. And this bear wanders in the village and no one can kind of take control, and they don't have the weapon systems and they don't have the appetite to be able to deal with this threat that's facing their village. And so the bear slayer, Lech Plessis, moves out and with his bare hands tackles and takes the bear down and actually destroys the bear in a very violent way of taking the jaws and ripping the jaws apart, killing the bear and saving his village. But this is an interesting time in Latvian history because at this point in time you have just the end of World War I where you had the battles with the Germans, and you have the Red Army starting to seep into Latvia. And so as you get into the initial freedoms of Latvia, you have this imagery of the bear and of someone that maybe doesn't have all the defenses but has the will. And that's something that's very important as an incoming commander to consider, the culture and background of the very proud nation that has lived in the shadow of the Great Bear for a great number of years. But for you as a commander, really, you're working in the shadow of the expectation of those warriors that are designed to defend this country. And it is invested in almost every aspect of Latvian society. And so you have poems and plays. You have a statue as a centerpiece, the Freedom Monument in the center of Riga, where all national memorials are done. Lech Plessis plays a central role in this. You have parades and Lech Plessis days of national celebration. Their highest military honor is the Order of Lech Plessis, awarded by the head of state for valor. It's a beer. And it's a rock opera. And so there is almost nowhere you can go inside of Latvian culture where Lech Plessis doesn't pay some type of important piece. But I think this is what we use as our thread to kind of tie ourselves as warriors to our host. And I think it's important understanding that kind of deep memory of events as you move through kind of Eastern European history, and the present connection that the Latvian people hold with that ongoing mythology as they now create a nation that again was recreated in 1993. And the ambassador reminded me that the music of Lech Polices with the rock opera was very important right around the time of the Russian occupation and the end of the Russian occupation, because there's so many double entendres in there. It was actually used as a part of their quiet rebellion inside the East. And so what I would say is it's just important to kind of recognize, and as Canadians, we're not overly, we don't have an exceptional understanding of the Baltics or of that time in history. And so I just thought I'd start with that perception and the kind of understanding of the framework as we go in. And so I'll now get into a little bit more of the traditional stuff. So what were we doing? So I had a job to deter and if necessarily defend Latvia's population and territory against aggression. This is closely defined along Article 5 lines. And so as we get into the history of the mission and how did we get here after the fall of Crimea and then now the ongoing violence that we still see in the Donbass with Russian aggression, this is something that kick-started the how do we have an overt presence inside of the Baltics to be able to demonstrate our support for some of our closest allies. So how are we going to do it then? I think we have to break this down into two parts. One, because Dr. Nossel makes me do work, I'll kind of explore what I'm looking at academically. And so for the academics in the room, I'm interested in kind of from a research perspective background is the stratactical problem set. And that's a connection as we look at how technologies and leaders are now connected with, we saw today with Mr. Trudeau, so quickly to information. So for a tactical leader, if you look historically, the stratactical problem is the tactical level. A lowly lieutenant colonel leading a small battle group is directly connected to multiple leaders, and in fact, in this case, 9 national leaders with 9 national interests and 9 ambassadors, and 10 if you include the Latvians. And so that's a change in operations. And then 2 is really framing potential conflict and the Article 5 dilemma that we see ourselves in right now. And so we have to understand that Article 5, and I can see the students nodding and maybe everybody else will brush up, is you have to have an attributable action with an attributable force. And this has been carefully targeted by our competitors to stay just below that threshold. And then what does that mean now? In the old days, it might have been special operations, spying, espionage, violent or specific violent acts attributed to proxy. But now we see things like heavy artillery rolling across borders, and it's not attributed to those forces. And so this puts us into a different space in NATO, and as a commander, puts you in a different space because now you have to tie yourself back to strategic decision makers at the tactical level because those decisions will have to be made quickly. And then part 2 is maybe just a bit more fun for those in the room that are Canadian and are interested in what our forces are doing. And so I'll walk through the environment that we worked in Latvia. What are we actually doing in Latvia? And understanding I'm about 10 months out of theater now and things change quickly. I've done a vector check with the guy that's in charge right now and we're pretty much still in line. And so we'll talk a little bit of an integration discussion. We'll talk about a tale of 2 narratives. You're competing against people that believe that diversity of nations is important and is good. And you then have, actually there's people within NATO that don't believe that and would like to see homogeneous nation-state groupings so that decisions can be made faster. Both are legitimate, but you're competing against those narratives as you're commanding. Your physical, moral, and informational planes, I'll provide you a small example of sometimes where it's okay to be lucky as a commander, but where it can actually spiral information quite quickly from what you thought was an innocuous small exercise. And I'll have a couple of small videos just to keep people awake. And then finally, I'll give you a bit of that context as it applies to armor. And because armor and the discussion inside of Canada and other nations is what is its relevance and then do people pay attention to it? And I'll kind of provide you from a tactical standpoint how a small amount of armor actually gains an awful lot of attention from across the border. And so points of discussion from the 2 narratives, information flow, and then the questions really that I'm looking at with the paper I'll be talking about with Dr. Nossel is deterrence is really a strat communications tool. And you know, for Trevor in the back room, we just had General Rulo in last week, and those are his words, so I guess it's real. But the perception is reality. And so often, as I kind of looked into this, it's not even whether or not what you've done on the ground, it's what you're perceived to have done on the ground is actually maybe more important. So, part 1. As we go through and we look at kind of 21st century context from a Canadian perspective, how do we understand it? And we see just below the waterline political pressure, interference, technologies disruption, and then kind of proxy force pieces. And then above the waterline, things that everyone understands, then actively and openly participates in with state-on-state conflict and what could be called asymmetric warfare or irregular warfare. And then on the left-hand edge of the spectrum, peacekeeping, capacity building, and maybe counterinsurgency. And we'll get into what the spectrum is and whether or not it's still relevant. But the issue that started, the thinking that's kind of evolved now, is that the line of not seen is rising. And so people are willing to accept more tactical risk, and it's an accepted piece where now in the news you'll see special operations forces conducting missions in Syria. All nations deny there are special operations operating in Syria, and yet it's being openly discussed. And so where is that line going to go as we now see, for example, from a U.S. perspective, U.S. Marine M777 artillery supporting special forces operations against ISIL in the open source, and yet there's no conventional forces that are actually operating inside those areas. Or alternatively, from the Russian perspective, you have Russian artillery operating inside the Donbass and conducting major offensive operations, and yet there's no acknowledgement whatsoever. There's unofficial acknowledgement, but no acknowledgement as it applies to UN Security Council resolutions, NATO ability to stand. And what does that mean for us from a fighting force perspective and from an Article 5 perspective, and that kind of idea of declaration of war? And so we go from this kind of continuum of peace to maybe a continuum of through like constant war, and that's something that I'm kind of investigating, and I haven't really landed on it yet, and I'll sure Dr. Nuss will tell me whether I'm right or wrong. And so just a bit of writing from a Canadian, two senior leaders, one in 2005, and as we get into the mission, consider Canadian policy. And so General Vance, now our Chief of Defense Staff, wrote in 2005 that in fact there is a very small operational level. So the operational level is that area that you translate strategic intent into tactical action. And that it's so small, in fact, because we achieve strategic outcomes by deploying tactical forces. So let's think about our kind of more recent operations in Afghanistan, a battle group, a headquarters. To Canada, a big commitment. To other larger forces, maybe a smaller commitment, but those are tactical forces conducting tactical actions, achieving what would be Canadian strategic intent. And General Vance would say, or did say, that really a redefined way of thinking about Canadian strategy is not so much because we are merely contributors to other people's coalitions, is really about a tactical organization and then understanding how to control or how to command that strategically to ensure that those two pair up. This has now been kind of reflected by recent thinking with General Rouleau out of our CJOC as he's come out with his How We Fight initiative and is working towards academics to start to kind of pull the threads on this. But he sees it along the same way with communications as it applies right now, with the prevalence of various media sources and with the requirements for speed. How does this then affect the tactical commander on the ground who is more directly connected to strategic outcomes? And he sees that operational space getting smaller, so that strategic commander. So where maybe in the late 90s, early 2000s, we would say, look, we have the rise of the strategic corporal because that corporal is making decisions on the ground that matters. Maybe we're starting to see a reflection or a refraction where we see, unfortunately, the rise of the tactical minister who is able to reach right down and talk to those tactical elements. And so for everybody in the room, and I just offer this from a Canadian perspective, because as a Canadian commander, this is starts to become your reality, as really you should be dealing with a single boss of a military, in a military uniform. And in fact, you have multiple touch points that you have to kind of balance out, and it's a challenge. But I just think it's important to understand. So how do we get there? And I think the ambassador put us on a good role, but I think that it's important to recognize that it was a reaction to Russian aggression inside the Crimea, and then an ask for a request for support. And it's something as North Americans we have a hard time grasping. We haven't been occupied. We haven't just recently, if you think less than a generation ago, that the wall fell. And so this is very much reality for those countries on our eastern flank. And that threat, they understand that they work inside what this is, the sphere of influence for it. And so being able to reinforce assure and reassure is something that's key. And so the initial declaration from NATO is one, a big step because it's kind of pointing a finger, acknowledging what's going on in the Crimea or in the Ukraine, which is not something anybody really wanted to do. And then two, actually attributing forces to it. The important thing to understand about the battle groups, as the ambassador pointed out, is they are small. So you're facing 3 or 4 divisions just across the border, divisions being 16,000 troops or more. You're in command of 1,600 troops, so 10 times your size. But what's important, if you remember the 10 uniforms, is that each of those countries are represented, and so really you're in the fight as soon as it kicks off, once the fight is declared. And so how does this look? It looks like we're just trying to establish a defensive posture. We cannot be used for offensive action, and we've established a toe hold and foot on the ground to be able to flow in other forces from there. And we reaffirmed this in 2018, and so now Canada will be set until 2023 leading this mission, where we'll see if another NATO partner will take on the lead. But it seems as though we're right now invested until 2023 with our partners from Latvia. So we talked about the band and the continuum. Left-hand edge, total peace. Right-hand edge, combat operations. Seems easy. You would start somewhere and then you would escalate your way through and you would see certain things just below the surface, political subversion, proxy, and until you got into overt war, somewhere along there there'd be a war declaration. But that's really not what we're seeing right now. We're seeing constant competition inside of the space. And so let's talk about information warfare. And so there was a guy, and I don't think it's Russian doctrine, named Gerasimov, that talked about, essentially he understood they couldn't defeat the US system of systems. So what do you need to do? You need to kind of defeat the idea. And so this is something that's just constant inside of Russian doctrine and perception, and something that Latvia and that part of the world has to constantly defend against. And so everything as simple as Latvia is dying out, no one left to work, or an attack on the roads, the infrastructure isn't good enough to support NATO troops. These are things that you have to be very aware of as a commander coming in, because you're now, what you say and how you act and how your soldiers act inside this environment is pretty key to what you're going to do. But where does that fit on the very neat spectrum that's been created? Actually, it fits throughout, and so it's not all at one time. The next step, I'd say, is active combat below the threshold, where before we would have said peace support and COIN as a response to it, but is it? And so when you see an SA-19 36 kilometers inside of the Ukrainian border, and they're conducting fire missions on Ukrainian command and control nodes, and really it's not attributable because the Russians say, look, there's no markings, it's impossible this could be Russian. Well, is it a willful blindness? Or why is it? But it's important because if you look at this as a case study from a NATO perspective, where do we look at our line for attribution or non-attribution, particularly if there's limited war aims of, let's say, 50 kilometers of Latvian territory or 100 kilometers? When is the decision made? Is it valuable and will we immediately trigger, or will there be so much discussion that it will be too late? And then finally, of course, you kind of have the Article 5 response. And remember that inside this environment, you're always working in medium-range missile range. And so you are always outgunned, you are always targeted, and it's always well understood. And so whether it's Russian A2AD, so if the whole plan is focused on reinforcement, and yet ships and planes can't get in, it's just something to consider. And so from there, in terms of your Article 5 response, if 2/3 of your activities are always going to be below the waterline, and the most risky to everyone, and the least plausible is the Article 5 response, what are you actually playing at, and where do you have to compete inside of it? And does it fit into our very kind of clean understanding of the concept of war? And maybe it doesn't. And that's where some of the academic work is going, is what do we look at from an Article 5 perspective, and then how do we lower that threshold, or where do we allow a little bit more evolved response from there? And so really, this isn't a linear problem. This is a nonlinear problem of multiple inputs at all times. And it's something that military commanders and politicians now have to kind of work through. And so if you look at it from a three-dimensional space, in terms of covert state involvement, again, really, most of our space works here. Top right-hand box of overt mission sets of peace enforcement, regime change, territorial conquest, those are least likely in a very connected world of marketplace and understanding. But those other three, the Russians have been able to achieve limited war aims in Crimea, in Georgia, in now the Donbass, a little bit in Syria, through non-attributable action and through limited capability. And so as military leaders and as politicians, this is where do our tools still fit the problem set, and does Article 5 need to evolve, and what's an attack? And so I think it's more of a three-dimensional space where persuasive, coercive, and as we work through it, we're pretty good at understanding total war. We don't want to do it, but we understand what it is. We understand when the lines are drawn. But I think what we need to consider, and something that I considered here, is the Article 5 line, and then where do we continue to work? And I don't have the answer yet, but we'll see how the paper goes and go from that. But as a commander in this environment, this is something that really kind of spoke to me because the first question the Latvian army will ask you is like, are you ready? Like, are you ready to go right now? Because the soldiers on the ground care about that. And of course you say yes, like my radios won't work and I'll drive east, because that's how as a soldier you act. But you do know that you have 9 nations. So how much Latvian ground is it worth to another country inside the organization? So even if Canada supports, we're only 1/9 of this battle group. Does everyone come in line as quickly as we require them? And are all those assets available? And this is the tale of two narratives. And so this is really where we find ourselves as I get into what we're doing. And so if we look at like the kinetic piece, just a single action, we say, okay, we have a ton of countries aligned in the 3 Baltic countries. And for that, they look at a kinetic reaction, limited kinetic reaction. But what they can bring into play from an info domain, social media, financial, and political is quite strong, because that's 9 countries of just inside the Baltics that are now tweeting, discussing, moving out in Latvia, and making sure that that discussion is out and is important. And so we would say, or inside our battle group, we said, just like the ambassador, cohesion, very important, credibility and truth. And if you can maintain those 3 things, you're actually going to be on the side of right, because we're doing what is required to be able to support the peoples of the Baltic states. And the intent of our competitor, with all the divisions on the side, is really to destabilize, fragment, and undermine. And the kind of center point of that risk really isn't in the center of Riga, but really kind of exists just about 100 kilometers along the boundary, where you find what could be, like the ambassador spoke about, populations that have Russian ethnicity or speak Russian and get all their media from Russia in Russian. And so the problem then isn't about attacking anything. The problem is probably about communicating. And so that's where I'll kind of start with how did we execute our mission, and how do we maybe seek to win this kind of competition in a non-kinetic environment. So Latvia. For those of you that don't know where it is or what it is, it's a fantastic country of about 1.5 million people, maybe a little bit more. And most of the population is centered in and around the capital of Riga, which is a popular port town for all sorts of vacation spots. And in particular, the UK has a fascination with Riga, and a historical connection with a military fight that happened there in the First World War. But as you can see from the pictures, this is a very modern country. We look up in the right-hand corner, this guy gets a disproportionate amount of attention, but actually he's a small part of every day. It's not sitting in the shadow of Putin. Really, this country goes on about its business, and the idea or threat of cyber and being fake news, well, you have military leaders like my brigade commander that have a Facebook page, they're out in the open, and they're communicating. And they know that through cohesion, truth, and viable action, they're going to do it. And the bottom left, we talked about hockey. That's an interesting byproduct, because the Riga hockey team, Riga Dynamo, is a owned KHL team that operates and works against or plays against Russian teams. The majority of the team is Latvian, with 4 Canadians, 3 from Saskatchewan. And it's all pretty good, but interestingly at the start, it's a bit of a soft power play, because the Russian anthem is played at the start in the theater. And it's interesting as a Canadian going to watch a game and understanding that there's a love-hate, love of the game, love of the connection. Not a huge fan of the national anthem being played at the start. And as you speak to the Latvian soldiers and travel with them, this is something that is an interesting byproduct. And so you can start to develop some of the complexity. As we talked about the percentages, and the ambassador corrected me, perhaps 16% as ethnic Russians. Then you have Poles that speak Russian, Ukrainians that speak Russian that happen to live in Latvia. But the interesting piece, they're really bordered Alūksne, Rezekne, and Daugavpils along that border here, with a university in Daugavpils and Rezekne. And that starts to be the tone of two narratives. Really, everybody has rights. There's education allowed inside the Russian language, but the fissure, and what the ambassador spoke about, are those points of pressure that Russia can say is, you are not allowing language rights inside Latvia. You're hurting minority language rights. Education, our peoples are not being treated well, and so if you're looking for an excuse, if I need an excuse as Russia to step over that boundary, it's to save, in quotation marks, those populations. And so you see, as we discuss the mission, why did we get out of the Riga area and then maybe start to like make sure we just communicate with those peoples. So where do we fit? And so we fit into a Latvian organization, a brigade. And that Latvian brigade, based out of Adagi, just outside of Riga, is here with the EFP battle group. We're a very small part of that force. We bring about 1,600 forces to bear, but we do provide firepower and we provide mobility. But Latvia itself, and Canada doesn't have this in their home nation, is divided as NATO declared, and that means they answer to a national chain of command and they answer to a Latvian chain of command, or NATO chain of command. And so that's an interesting part. It's hard enough to have one boss. Think about as you start to develop and you have two bosses every day, and you've got those pressures. And so you've got a division, the brigade, the division, and then a corps based out of Poland that now really cares about what is essentially Latvian national defense policy and how they're going to about to do their business. And so your battalion down here is something that's highly connected into both of those bosses. NATO declared, but working for a Latvian brigade commander inside of a NATO context. And this is what we look like on the ground. So any good military presentation has a line diagram. I wanted to just present it because of the flags. And so what's important here across the top, and this has changed a little bit, the nations haven't changed, but we've added Montenegro to this, is that you have a combination of armor, artillery, mobility, engineers inside of this battle group. And it all works very well. What people should understand is up here, you have each of those companies. So a company is about 160 people. Each of those companies has a national commander on the ground. So a guy like me, a lieutenant colonel, over top of each of those leaders. So it's great to have one boss, but sometimes, you know, now you've got 9 other people that are vitally interested in what you're doing with your subunits on a daily basis. And each of those subunits have tasks. And so you can see from the dotted line, pre-Article 5, these guys control the activities and the sustainment of these guys. At Article 5, now we start to see them come under direct command of NATO. And so it's just a nuance to understand as you go through there, but from a command and control perspective, there's a sensitivity and a negotiation that may have to occur for different things that you want to do. And so patience and planning is probably 2 of your key attributes. So, but what does it look like on the ground, and what are the scale of activities? And so as you look at this, kind of like things that go boom, consider that each of the safety lessons, the rules of each organization are different. And so how do you build concurrency and a team inside of that environment? So interestingly, the Russians left behind a lot of garbage, explosives, and so now, and unfortunately we lost 2 Albanian soldiers to this, now one of the biggest things we can do to help is we clean up, and thousands of UXOs, there's a tight connection between the Latvians and their forests, and unfortunately there's lots of unexploded ordnance in those forests. And so these are the type of things that we produce. So that's the Latvian 100th anniversary celebrations. International fighting is their thing. It's good. So I offered that just as a quick view for what we're looking at and the variety of tasks that the battle group does. And so you saw in there outreach to local orphanages, schools, interaction with Latvian political level, and then of course the military training piece that's required, and good because just learning how everyone does their business. And so this is how we visualized the problem. And so on the board, each of these weapons were built by the soldiers of the battle group. On the board, I challenged everyone to what is your country's edged weapon? And so whether you have the fine steel of the Spanish Toledo blade, the lance of Poland, the axe from the shepherds of Slovakia, or the Canadian tomahawk, or the broadsword of Slovenia, figures the smallest unit has the largest weapon. But if you, they all came together. But if you look at it, it's very much a talk of how you can look at the units. Different material, so if you break the steel of the Toledo blade, it has to come from Spain. They're used differently. Some are used as thrusting weapons, some are used as long range, some are tight-in weapons. And so either this is the group was never meant to actually work together in any way or form. And so you can look at it two ways. You can look at it and say, okay, it's a wall of pretty, but pretty useless tools because they don't really work together. They're not designed or engineered to fit together. They're not designed or engineered to use the same types of steel. There's a lot of problems that go here. Or if you're the commander, you have to kind of look at it and say, I have the most agile, capable fighting force that's ever been, and diversity is our strength because there's a whole bunch more spears where that one came from. And so if I need another one, I know there's someone that has my back, and I have that there. And that's how we decided to approach the problem. But that's not really the narrative that exists everywhere. And so that's a picture of my corps commander, open source and open speeches. And so he's in charge of the corps that owns the 4 EFPs. And what he would like to see is far more pure units. He'd like to see a Canadian battle group, a British battle group, an American battle group, and a German battle group, all with one chain of command and one capability. And he has a point also. And so it's just something to understand as we look and congratulate ourselves inside of the experiment that is EFP. We have to remember that NATO was never designed to integrate below corps, and now we're integrating at section level. And so in the battle group, you have a section of Montenegrins inside a Slovenian platoon that works inside of a Canadian reconnaissance element. And so this is a pretty incredible happening, and actually probably one of the most exciting things I've ever done in my career, but it's not really how it was all designed to be put together. And so if you're a traditionalist, you may say, hey, there's like a little bit too much red, there's a little bit too much forming there, and what we'd like to see is a little bit more consistency and stability, which we get when one nation makes a decision, one nation provides the resources. And so for the commander on the ground, the challenge then is, how do you maintain this message? Because all the countries there provided just enough to get in. They have their flag up on the wall. That's pretty good. And they're pretty happy that they're there, and they want to have a positive outcome. And then you're combating inside your own change of command, and he's got a legitimate professional opinion that says, hey, got it, but I don't want this. I want something else. I'll accept this for now, but when the war starts, I want pure fighting forces that can come to. And you can see both sides of that. But again, the tale of two narratives not helpful inside of an organization that is already fighting a third narrative from outside the country. And so what are your ends, ways, and means as a commander? And so really, you never contribute, or you don't give strategic end states, but you do demonstrate and reassure commitment, resilience, and NATO strength. Resilience we would understand differently in Canada. In Canada, we speak about personal resilience. In NATO, resilience is about your nation state able, because all of those countries have been occupied at one time or another, able to understand and survive warfare or natural disaster. And so just understanding that and demonstrating that there is some resilience there at the strategic level is important. Operational, integrate NATO forces and reinforce the Latvian brigade in terms with both the NATO plan and with the Latvian National Defense Plan. And then finally, be a legitimate deterrence force. And what does that mean? It means that how do you actually show that you can and will fight if necessary? And that's something that often is a little bit lost in the political talk, and I think is important in the discussion as we look at these pieces. But the ways are something that are non-traditional or non-binary. I don't have the right on non-Article 5 to order anybody to do anything. I can move people around for training and exercises. I can posture people inside of Latvia with permission from their country, so I have to ask first because they're paying the bills, because this is a activity, not a mission. And then Stratcom is yellow because actually I have to infuse both NATO Stratcom principles and understandings, plus the other 9 nations, 10 nations, including Latvia's Stratcom perceptions. And then situational awareness. And if you think about it, for the intelligence professionals in the room, you have no other Five Eyes partners inside of that battle group. And so sharing and understanding those pieces are actually quite interesting when you share an intelligence cell inside of a battle group where you need to have tightly turned information that can then be pushed out into operations immediately. And then the means by which I can do this are the national commitments, and that's one thing that, interestingly, the strat level will tie right down to the battle group commander to say, what do you need and what do you want? And then they'll cycle back to your nation, and you have to be very careful there when you're walking that space. Formalize multinational command and control as that comes online a little bit better. And then our combat capability, and mostly it's about the outreach with the population. And so the ambassador spoke about how do you win in this environment? You win in this environment by open communication and honesty. And you are the platform by which NATO can do that. And you're the only platform inside of the nation to do that for NATO. And so the declared pieces are easily understood at Article 5. You'll see that undeclared is difficult to understand before you hit Article 5. So this is what it kind of looks like. And I don't want to go into the detailed lines, but understand this. At the top, these are bosses, right? So sending nations times 9, Canada, Latvia, and then NATO bosses. And there's 2 lines. 2 lines, NATO, and so in peacetime, deter, you have EFP doctrine, conceptual framework, and lots of permissions and requests. And then should you move into the war fighting, and it's in the classified box in the defend, then everything gets a lot simpler, and these bosses all become one supposedly in NATO. I don't know that we've seen that recently in terms of even when war starts, you only go down to 1 boss, but that's kind of what it should look like from a line diagram. So as we mapped our network, what did it actually look like? It actually looks more like this. And so this is something that as commanders or as professionals going into policy or as you look to instruct more junior leaders, this is what you actually look like on a day-to-day basis. And so that's my actual boss and that's my Canadian boss. That's really anybody who should talk to me or I should talk to. That's not a fact. What's an actual fact is all of these folks dotted in straight lines have direct or indirect influence on you. They all have stakes and they're all interested in what you have to do. And so on any given day, the command cell in the headquarters, you have Italians in your headquarters, you have Slovakians in your headquarters, they're answering, they have each of these for themselves too. And so if you think about as you expand out your network, any given day, you're dealing with 9 nations' concerns of their deployed forces. And so what did we do? We looked at focus on. We looked at focusing on demonstrating will and capability, or understanding will and capability of the adversary, but really it was about building trust and support within the Latvian community. We were still a new mission at that point in time, and there was lots of messages. If you remember, when Colonel Wade Rutland went into the very first mission, they took pictures of a Canadian Forces colonel who had been accused of murder and sexual crimes and had said, hey, this is what Canadian leadership looks like. And so that environment, and not knowing that environment, is something that the constant recycling of goodwill is something that you have to consider. And so we focused in there. We focused on the Latvia population, and particularly in the eastern branch of the country, which allowed us to get out and to understand the country a bit better. And so how are we doing after 18 months? And so for the Canadians in the room, how are your tax dollars being spent and how's it going? So on the left-hand side, it was about establishing trust. They created rules. There was no rules for an EFP. So rules and how do you work? The communications, you think it's simple, but it's not. So this wheel of pain that Wade faced, the Canadians and the Italians were the only countries that could talk to each other. That's not good. Because inside your own tactical level. And so there's 2 things at play. One, different radios. Land is different than the air and the sea domain. Different radios, different cryptology. It's not just that. Companies like Harris are very smart, and they have programmed certain permissions for certain countries, and you have to buy new permissions to be able to talk to other radios. And so it's quite a bit of work. And so at that point in time, the Russian narrative could have been found to be true initially. And you'd say, wow, we can only talk in plain text. We can't achieve an operating picture. And it's all reliances of 1940s runners and bicyclists to go pass messages, which may work in a denied environment also, but we shouldn't be starting there. And so over 18 months, and this isn't a Steve Macbeth story, this is a story of the battle group for the other commanders also, you get to a point where now you're a TACSAT capable communications, voice and data, and tactical interoperability in only 18 months. And so that's a pretty good story for an institution that was never supposed to work at this level, interoperability. And it's not about the organization, because that organization isn't necessarily believing that what you're doing is important. It's about the people, and I would say that all those countries are invested to make it work. And then finally, this is what gets people really upset, is sustainment. And it's because that's where money's involved. And so national sustainment, you really have, if you have one road, you have 9 nations trying to use that one road, and they don't have to answer to the control measures. And so that's a cultural piece. That's people solving problems, and that's still not formally solved yet. But what I would say is here, Latvia had a large exercise, Namaj, where they wanted to demonstrate a movement of their armor. They contract trucks to do it. The trucks either were late or something was didn't work. And so we provided the trucks, which was great sustainment support from NATO. But this is a Spanish truck with a Slovakian flatbed with a Latvian vehicle. If you think about just the safety parameters on a road, that's risk. That's a picture of risk right there, right? So if that vehicle slides off, who's in trouble? The truck driver, the Canadian commander, the Slovakian guy that made the flat rack, the Spanish truck driver? We're not quite sure, and no one likes that. Everybody wants to know who owns risk. And so low-end tactical risk becomes operational and strategic risk, because if that vehicle had slidden off and killed a Latvian citizen, there would have been answers to pay. But at the time, the risk was valuable enough, and people and a culture is what makes a difference there. So how do we move out? So we spread ourselves across the country, and we looked at it as a big rotation around the country. What did this allow us to do? It allowed us to understand road systems, populations, interaction with Estonia, with Lithuania, and with Poland. And then, of course, that band right along here is really where we focused, because we didn't have any access through either Latvian or English language to actually have a presence to be able to talk to the peoples that perhaps were getting their media from other sources. And the ambassador was good enough to share with me that, in fact, the most recent Russian-speaking population surveys that have been done, there's been a decrease in or an increase in pride in Latvia and Latvian living in Latvia, and a decrease in the kind of like divisive nature and discussions that have been occurring. And so maybe we're a small part of that, a small part. Really, it's about the Latvian government doing outreach and understanding inside their own political processes. And so envision this country as something to be able to go out in our giant training area, and that's 9 countries. The United States are involved, and large exercises on the other side. On the other side of this line, that's where those kind of 3 divisions are. So we're kind of pushing a little 1,000-person organization around, and they're pushing 3 times 16,000 people around. And so when you read kind of Russian idealism of like the threat of NATO, let's scale it and have that discussion in an honest way. And so how did we look to get out? And so just some of the outcomes from that. Sometimes the problem isn't the problem. And so the Russians had put out a messaging that Latvia's road systems were not effective to be able to move NATO armor. And so we went out of our way to kind of prove that wrong. And we said, okay, you say that, we're going to connect to all the places we may have to reinforce, and we're going to push armor to all of them. That took us then 150 bridges assessed by NATO engineers, and then took some work between Ministry of Transport and Ministry of Defense to be able to do those things. And it was shown to be resilient and increased resilience. We demonstrated an ability for communications between the 3 countries, and then coordination between 19 NATO countries at one time. And so if you're thinking about 900 square kilometers for a single command and control node, it's pretty good. And really, you're going to put about 93 armored vehicles out and about 1,000 soldiers. But as importantly, to each of these towns, we put about 160,000 euro into that economy whenever we show up. And so as a secondary outcome from that, consider the buying food, gas, and then interactions with those populations. And it's a fantastic experience for the soldiers, cultural experience, and I think all sides benefit from it. And so what does it look like? And so this is where we started getting into the information space. We started now getting into, of course, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and media, but actually that wasn't important. You know what was important is people consumed media by radio and TV in Latvia. And so we had to change our network. Everyone had talked about, we thought we were competing in the space that the Russians were competing on, which was online. But in fact, when you look at media assessments and the penetration's great, but actually news is done through Latvian news. And so that became interviews. And that became interviews and how we go through. And so just from a numbers perspective, 28, kind of 1 per week for outreaches, presence 34, and then visits. These guys, prime ministers and presidents, at no time shall a lieutenant colonel be interacting with heads of state. It's just not what we do. And yet, that's exactly what happened. And so you have a visit from each of the heads of state, because that, for some countries that's their largest deployed element out. Then you see all the ambassadors, the ministers of defense, the chiefs of defense, and then the various commanders that come to visit. And we only kind of put 2-star and up there. But for those that are going to go work in this environment, you can count on almost daily visits from some country, and then needing to understand their perspective and their context. And as the Lieutenant Colonel discussing, understanding that our Chief of Defense and our Prime Minister are the only people that talk about Canadian defense policy, these guys have serious questions that you're equipped nor authorized to talk about. And it leads to some interesting kind of exchanges of like, I have no opinion about that. But if you call this guy, they might have an opinion. And so it's pretty entertaining. Engagements outside about 5 per week, and then about 9 per week total, so more than 1 a day in terms of influence activities. And the red circles kind of denote where we focused our efforts: Riga, Ventspils, which is great, and then down in Daugavpils, and then up in Alūksne. And really, it was interesting because we thought our Facebook might be a bit of an echo chamber. The minute we changed and put Latvian language onto it, wow, the response and the Latvian interaction was fantastic. And now we see the videos being posted kind of topping out at 250,000 views, and so being shared widely. And so it's pretty interesting the small amount of influence you can start to generate from that type of platform. And so why armor matters, and so I'll get into the information space a bit. I'll show you the small piece, and I'll tell you a story beforehand. So tanks are hard to move, and each of the battle groups has a certain amount of tanks. I called the 3 other battle group commanders, Brit, German, and American, and said, hey, do you have the same problem I do? My tankers are trapped on camp. We need to do something for them. There was no strategic thought to this. There was zero understanding that it would have anything else to do with us. I said, sure, let's get together, get all the tanks together, and we'll have a competition. And so, okay, that was just the week that Russia said that you can't move armor on Latvian roads, and then all of a sudden, all the armor from all the EFPs flows into Latvia on Latvian roads. Super lucky, didn't mean to do it, but it drew attention, and it was interesting because we didn't think anything of it, but actually the guys across the border did. So this was kind of what we did. And the important thing here is what you'll see. I'll go through the reading and we'll talk after. So what we'll do then is just kind of skip through, and what was the results of that? The results there then are kind of 200 responses from the Russians, and this is a small amount. It's kind of 60 tanks on the ground, and they said, okay, what you would have seen is kind of some shooting. There was some hitting and some missing, so they actually counted rounds and then talked about who hit and who didn't. They made fun of the British because they have yellow blinky lights on the top. It's just part of their safety because you got to run 3 ranges inside of 1. And then they made fun of the American tank because they're like, that's a tank for the desert. They don't even know what country they're in. And so it was interesting because something that we thought didn't mean anything meant a lot to the folks across the border. And they really highlighted it. And they said, and the only other tank that's going to work is that Polish PT-91, which is a Russian variant. And they're like, that's the only tank that actually has any capability to defend Latvia. As interestingly, large organizations don't talk very well. Trident Juncture, which is the largest NATO exercise, was being run simultaneously. That then led to us not being tied to Trident Juncture, and then success has many fathers. And so all of a sudden we got huge coverage as part of Trident Juncture, and they took our little exercise and added on top, and they said, oh, look at NATO tanks by the border as part of Trident Juncture. And so you have both blue information activities and red information activities overlaying. And it was just an example of like the very delicate information space of something that you don't think is going to be anything and becomes something big. And so I'll look to close there. And in terms of the outputs and outcomes that we share with our Latvian partners, I hope I gave you a presentation of what Canada's doing, some of the obstacles that we face, some of the narratives that are increased, and then at the front end, really some of the academic work that's starting to be looked at from an Article 5 perspective and the modernization of those ideas on the spectrum of conflict. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of minutes for a couple of questions. I know that we're kind of pushing against the end here, but let's have one or two questions. Go ahead.
My question is for you, sir. You described the many tasks you had to do as part of the battle group, and but I'm just wondering, as part of such a complex environment, and then with the threat that you described is really subversive and it defies conventional parameters, how do you evaluate operational success, and how do you evaluate if it's working?
So that's actually, so something toward the end, so now it's probably more mature, is the Latvian government, and it's owned by them, is very good at going out to understand their own population, just like we would have census in Canada. The Latvian government goes out, and so are we seeing more Russian speakers liking living in Latvia more so than favoring the Russian partner? The answer is right now yes. And so I'd say that rests solely inside, because we don't collect information or intelligence that we classify as intelligence on Latvia or Latvians. And so I would maybe defer that to the ambassador to see the measure of success, because that's really where the government fits in.
Would you like me to say, just comment?
Of course,
I would
please.
like to say that there was a sort of, this deployment of Canadian troops is sort of from an internal insecurity feeling among the Latvians. There is a big support for the Latvian army, naturally always been, but now this sort of internal security improved very much with this deployment, and it's not only among the Latvian. Nominally, we are all Latvians, but okay, sometimes people putting people in different small boxes. I'm half Estonian, for example, but still Latvian ambassador, you know. It's increased dramatically, you know, because people all, if you look at today's world, you see the troubles are everywhere. Even in this country, you have sometimes small misunderstandings, either in north or even south, you know, even here, but it increased internal stability, internal sort of people even thinking in a positive terms that, you know, it's worthwhile to live, you know. I'm a little bit exaggerating here, but after the, because it was a really big shock. Crimea was a shock, and it was a shock to Europe. And it was, if you see the Wales reaction in the summit in Wales and afterwards in Warsaw, you can see it was a tremendous shock for all civilized world, I would say, you know, that somebody can do it like this against any rules. Rules are written for what? Nobody knows for whom. And now they can do whatever they want, you know, and then they declare that the white is black and black is white, you know, and say this is new normality, you know. That was and nobody was almost ready to do something, but okay. And there was, well, in 1945, when war was ending, we were waiting when the democratic world, the Brits, Swedes, played out. It's not over, but the minds of the people are, I think, at least in Latvia, are already on the right side. It's not only Latvians, but also those who are probably ethnically are not so pure Latvians like me. You know.
Thank you, sir.
We'll take one quick last question.
I hope it's quick. It's actually a question for the ambassador. And the fact that you're half Estonian leads into it. Have you looked at doing joint military exercises with your neighboring countries such as Estonia to give that united front, not just within a country, but across them? Because we do have other battle groups in them as well.
Well, that's from the beginning, from 1991. I think our military cooperation among the Baltic states are the best. Okay. It's more difficult to cooperate on trade sometimes, on some kind of things, because we're producing similar things, you know, and we want to all be in British market with our forestry products. We succeeded, we are much better there. But on some another, but when it comes to military, you know, there was a Baldev call. It's in Tartu, you know, it's in Estonia, but it is the head of that school is now Latvian general, and there were, I think, recently 2 or 3 Canadians now. That's one project. There was also Baltron, which was navies were together, and it's all started by Baltic Battalion. But now, of course, we are in different stage. We are talking about even to buy the things together. And it's very difficult. You see, procurement is even difficult in one country. And to agree among these, you know, where to pay, where to put the taxpayers' money is very difficult. But we are slowly coming to it. Most importantly, I think you definitely know better than me that all these radar systems and all this stuff is quite coordinated. And yeah, and exercises are together all the time. And Adaži base is the biggest exercise field where Estonians are using frequently and Lithuanians using frequently and vice versa.
On that note, let me thank the ambassador and thank Steve very much for an excellent presentation today. On behalf of the Centre, a little reminder.
I already got the lunch.
Please join me in thanking our guests today for the presentation.